He could erase a person in one afternoon, but he couldn't erase her truth. Dominic thought Nora was just a witness. Instead, she forced him to face the monster his father created. This story reminds us nobody owns another human being. Like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The lights at St. Bridget's never really turned off. They just hummed, steady all night long, like a sound you stop hearing until your head starts to ache. By 3 a.m., Nora Bennett's head always ached. She was 32, 12 years on the floor, long enough to know the night shift wasn't a job. It was a kind of weather you learned to stand in. She pressed 2 fingers to an old man's wrist in Bay 4, counted, watched the monitor lie to her, then watched the truth in his pulse instead. "Fine, Mr. Alvarez," she said softly. "I've got you." He couldn't answer, but his hand turned just a little and found hers. People did that. Even the ones who couldn't speak. They reached. Nora squeezed back. Then she moved on. She was a big woman. She knew it. The scrubs pulled at her hips, and the new girls watched her move down the hall like they were waiting for her to knock something over. She never did. Dr. Patel asked for her by name on his worst nights. The trauma cases, and panic killed. "I want Bennett," he'd say. Because Nora's hands didn't shake. Because she saw a blood pressure dropping before the machine did. Because when the room went loud, she went quiet. Nobody put that on a poster. Nobody ever did. People remember a pretty face. They forget the woman who kept their heart beating. She'd made peace with that, mostly. In the break room, she finally sat, unlaced her sneakers. Her phone buzzed. A text from home. Her brother, Sam. "Can we watch the planets one again? Miss you." Sam was 26. He had the heart of a kid and lungs that didn't always cooperate. He couldn't live alone. He lived with her. He was the reason she picked up extra shifts. He was the reason she didn't quit when a parent's family called her a name she still heard in the shower. She typed back, "Yes, tomorrow. Bowl of popcorn. I promise." Then, quieter, to herself, "Just gotta get through tonight, bud." And her container of cold pasta, lifted the fork. The door swung open. "Nora, oh my God, I need you." It was Vivian Cross. Day shift float. Pretty in the way the world had decided pretty should look. She was clutching a pale blue cardigan to her chest like a life raft. "Vivian, I'm on my break. I know, and I hate myself. But Dr. Reyes needs vitals in 412. The VIP." And her voice cracked. Her eyes were red. "I just got a call. It's bad. I have to step out just for a minute. And if Reyes catches an empty floor, he'll write me up, and I can't lose this job. Not right now. Please." Nora set down the fork. In Vivian's face she didn't like. A flicker. Too fast to name. But she'd learned a long time ago that you don't always get to know why someone's drowning. You just decide whether you'll throw the rope. "Okay," Nora said. 2 minutes. "Where's the chart?" "Wear this." And pushed the cardigan into her hands. "It's freezing up there. North wing's always cold." Nora frowned at it. "I've got my own, just take it." Vivian was already backing toward the door. "You're a lifesaver. You really are." Then she was gone. In her lap a moment. Blue. Soft. Not hers. It barely closed across her chest, and it hid her badge under a fold of wool. She didn't think anything of it. That was the thing about kindness. You give it without reading the fine print. She stood. Her knees popped. She slipped the cardigan on, grabbed a cuff and a stethoscope, and headed for the elevator. The north wing was different. Quieter, carpeted even. Money lived up here. 412 had 2 men outside it in cheap suits who never smiled and never sat down. Except tonight they weren't there. Nora slowed. Big oak door to 412 stood open a crack, and on the frosted glass, dark and wet, was a smear that her whole body recognized before her mind did. Blood. Her heart kicked. Protocol. Back away. Call security. She turned, and the stairwell door opened. They came out fast. 4 of them. Black gear, faces covered, moving like they'd done it 100 times. No hospital badge. No reason to be here. In front raised a hand. Something gleamed in it. "Don't make a sound," he said. Low, flat. His eyes dropped to the blue cardigan. "You, the nurse on 412. Nora's mouth went dry as paper. "No," she managed. "No, I'm not. I'm just covering. That's her," he said to the others. Blue cardigan. The one who saw the ledger. "Move." Wait, she stepped back. Bumped a cart. Metal crashed. A gloved hand sealed over her mouth. She fought. God, she fought. She dropped her weight the way she did with patients who didn't want to be lifted. Made herself an anchor. Kicked hard and felt a knee give under her heel. Someone swore. She's strong. Hold her a sting in her arm. Sharp, cold spreading under the skin. The hall began to tilt. Dimming light smeared into long white ribbons. Her last clear thought wasn't fear. Sam. Tomorrow. Popcorn. I promised. Then the floor came up to meet her and the world went dark. Somewhere across the city, A man in a black suit checked his watch and waited for a frightened blonde to be delivered to his door. He had no idea they were bringing him the wrong woman. He had no idea she would be the one to change everything. The first thing was the smell. Not bleach. Not hospital. An old wood and something sweeter underneath cigars maybe, the expensive kind. Nora swam up out of the dark slow. Her tongue felt thick. Her head pounded like a fist on a door. She opened her eyes. A ceiling she didn't know. High, painted. Chandelier hanging from it like a frozen rain. She tried to sit up. In front of her, tight plastic biting the skin. She was lying on something hard and polished. A desk. A huge dark desk in the middle of a room full of books. Shelves climbing the walls all the way up to that painted sky. Her heart started to run. Where's Sam? Where am I? What time is it? Where's She's awake? A voice from the shadows. Deep, quiet. The kind of quiet that's worse than shouting. Into the lamplight. Tall. A black suit that fit him like it had been grown on him. Dark hair, a hard jaw, eyes the gray of a sky that's about to do something terrible. He held a glass of something amber and didn't drink it. He looked at her. And his face changed. Not soft, not kind. Confused, then angry. He looked at her face, her shoulders, the cheap scrub straining at her waist, the wool cardigan that wasn't hers. His jaw tightened. He turned his head. Marco. A second man came forward from the corner. Younger, nervous. Still half in the black gear from the hallway, mask shoved up on his forehead. Nora's stomach dropped. Him. Yeah, boss. I told you, the tall man said, and his voice dropped lower, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. To bring me the nurse from the 4th floor. The blonde. The small one. The one who has the drive. She had the blue cardigan. Marco swallowed. Tex said, look for the blue cardigan. She was right outside the door. Boss, I swear. The tall man set his glass down on the desk. Set it down soft. Then his hand swept sideways and it flew, and the crystal hit the far wall and burst into 100 bright pieces. Nora flinched. A small sound came out of her she hated. Do I look like I run a charity for the blind? He said. Still quiet. Look at her. The target is 110 pounds. Blonde. Look. At her. It was dark, She fought like hell. The cardigan matched Get Out. Marco got out. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him. Then it was just the two of them, and the broken glass, and Nora's breathing, which was loud and ragged and would not slow down. The man pinched the bridge of his nose, closed his eyes a second. When he opened them, he looked tired in a way that didn't match the suit. He came around the desk, reached into his jacket. Nora saw metal and her whole body locked. Please, the word fell out of her. Please. I don't know anything. I was eating my dinner. I was on my break. And I don't know who you are. I don't know what a ledger is. I just took over a room for a coworker because she was crying. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. Stop. He flicked his wrist. A knife came down and cut the tie at her wrists. Clean. She yanked her arms to her chest, rubbed the red lines in her skin. He stepped back, crossed his arms, looked at her like she was a math problem that had given him the wrong answer. What's your name? Nora, her voice shook. Nora Bennett. Well, Nora Bennett. He said it slow. You're here because my people are idiots. Unfortunately for you. You've seen my face. You've seen Marco's. You know where you were taken from. He paused. In my world. That's a problem. And problems get solved. She understood him. Understanding went through her cold and clean. But underneath the fear, something else moved. Something older than the fear. It's 12 years of looking dying people in the eye and refusing to lie to them. You want to kill me, she said. I want the problem gone. I'm not a problem. I'm a person. And came up even as her eyes filled. And you're not a problem solver. You're a man deciding whether to murder somebody who's never done a single thing to you. Those aren't the same. Dress it up however you want. A life isn't a loose end you snip off because it's tidier. The room went very still. He looked at her like no one had talked to him that way in a long time, maybe ever. I think you're in a position to lecture me on lives, he said. I've held more of them in my hands than you have, Nora said. I know exactly what one's worth. Something flickered behind the gray. Not warmth. Not yet. But something. He opened his mouth, and the doors burst open. A third man fell into the room, older, gray at the temples, and his hands were dark to the wrist with blood. Dominic, he gasped. It's Elio. The stitches tore. He's bleeding out in the east room. The doctor's not answering. He's not answering. Dominic, the tall man Dominic, was already moving. He got to the door, then stopped, turned, looked at Nora like he'd forgotten she was real and just remembered. Nurse. What, get up? It wasn't a request. If my brother dies tonight, I will bury you next to him. Move. For 1/2 second, Nora thought about the door, the window, Sam, home. Then the other thing took over. The thing that didn't ask permission. The thing that had been built into her over 12 years and 10,000 emergencies. The thing that didn't care whose blood it was. Somebody was bleeding out. She got up. Take me to him, she said. Full of paintings worth more than her life. She didn't see any of them. Into a bedroom, a big modern room, all glass and gray, and on the bed was a young man, maybe 25, soaked through, pale as paper. One hand pressed weak against his stomach where a bad bandage had gone dark and wet. He looked like a softer copy of the man beside her. Same jaw, younger eyes. And his voice was tight now, stripped of all that cold calm. They patched him at a backroom clinic. It just opened up again. Nora stopped being afraid. She didn't decide to. It just happened, the way it always happened. And the nurse stepped forward and took the wheel. Everybody who isn't helping, get out of my way, she said, and pushed past 2 men twice her size like they were curtains. She dropped to her knees by the bed. Her knees screamed. She ignored them. She peeled back the soaked dressing, looked, pressed both hands down hard, threw her weight into it. The way she'd learned a body's weight could be a tool and not a burden. Blood welled up hot between her fingers. The deep stitches gave way. He's losing volume fast. She didn't look up. I need clean towels. A lot of them. Boiling water. Any alcohol in this house, drinking alcohol's fine. So a sewing needle and the strongest thread you've got. And whatever antibiotics anybody in this building is hoarding. Now, go. Nobody moved. They looked at Dominic. Did you not hear her? Dominic roared. Move. They moved. And for the next 2 hours, a billionaire's bedroom became the worst, best trauma bay Nora had ever worked. She made the cold-eyed man hold clamps. She put the killer's hands exactly where she needed them and barked when he got it wrong. Her back ached. Sweat ran into her eyes. Her knees were bruising on the hardwood, and she did not stop, not once. And the boy's heart stuttered and stopped 10 seconds. The worst 10 seconds, it was Nora who climbed half onto the bed and drove the heels of her hands down into his chest with everything she had, and felt a rib give under the force and kept going anyway, because a cracked rib heals and a stopped heart doesn't. He came back, gasped. The monitor she'd rigged from a clinic kit beeped, ragged, then steadier. He came back, and when it was over, when the bleeding was stopped, and the wound was closed with neat, clean, professional stitches, Nora sat down hard on the bloody floor and just breathed. Her hands shook now. They were allowed to now. His brother's blood off his own hands with a towel. He'd expected a screaming, fainting mess. He looked down at the woman on his floor instead. At the soaked scrubs and the wild hair and the steady, fierce intelligence in her eyes, even now, even wrecked. He'd expected a liability. Something he didn't have a word for yet. For a long minute, nobody said anything. Elio breathed. Nora kept her eyes on his chest, watching it rise and fall. Counting without meaning to. Old habit. The body keeps score even when the mind checks out. Needs antibiotics in a vein, not a pill, she said finally. Her voice came out cracked, broad spectrum. And somebody has to watch him every minute for 2 days. If he spikes a fever over 102, that's not something I can fix on a bedroom floor. That's a real hospital, or he dies of infection. I want you to hear that part. I hear it, Dominic said. She nodded. Stayed on the floor. Wasn't sure her legs would work yet. Dominic dropped the bloody towel on a chair. He crossed to her, stood over her, huge in the dim light, and for one cold second she thought, this is it, I've done my use and now the problem gets solved. And he put his hand out, down, open. She looked at it. You saved his life, he said. Low, rough. I did my job, she said. She took the hand. He pulled, and she came up off the floor, heavy and ungraceful, and he braced and took her weight without a flicker, like it was nothing, like she was nothing to carry. She stood close to him, looked up, storm gray eyes very near. So, she said, can I go home now? His gaze dropped to her mouth, moved over her face, came back to her eyes. The cold was gone out of him. Something else had moved in. Something that scared her more than the cold had. No, he said. Quiet, almost gentle. No, it means you're not leaving. The words landed and sat there. Nora stepped back, pulled her hand out of his. I have a brother, she said. Sam, he's 26, and he can't be alone. He's got a bad heart and lungs that quit on him, and he is waiting up for me right now because I promised him popcorn and a movie tomorrow. So no, whatever this is, whatever you are, I am going home. People will look for me. I'm not a ghost. Yes, you are. He said it without cruelty, which was the worst part. He pulled a phone from his jacket and held it out. Or you will be by morning. Look. She didn't want to look. She looked. An email from her own address to St. Bridget's HR. Resignation effective immediately. Family emergency. Already sent. Another, her apartment lease terminated. Penalty paid in full. From an account with no name. I can erase a person in an afternoon, Dominic said, who quit and skipped town. No one looks hard for those. Nora's throat closed. Tears came up and she let them. She'd stopped pretending she was made of stone a long time ago. Crying wasn't weakness. It was just the body telling the truth. Understand, she said. You can erase a job. You can erase Elise. Not erase Sam. If I disappear, who takes care of him? You didn't make a problem go away tonight. You just put a sick man's whole life in danger because you wanted to win an argument with a stranger. That hit. She watched it hit. For a second, Dominic looked like a man who'd thrown a punch and only now saw who he'd hit. Who has him? He said. Right now. Tonight. A neighbor. Mrs. Okafor. Just for the night shift. Her voice broke. She's 70. She can't do it forever. She's doing me a kindness. Kindness, Dominic repeated, like it was a foreign word. He turned away, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her, hands in his pockets, looking out at a dark she couldn't see. My father, he said to the glass, used to say there's no such thing. Kindness. He said it was a story weak people tell, so the strong feel guilty for winning. He paused. He said a man is worth exactly what he can do for you. Nothing more. Nora wiped her face with the back of a bloody hand. Your father was wrong. He turned, looked at her. My brother Sam, she said. He can't work. Can't drive. Some days he can't get up the stairs without stopping twice. By your father's math, he's worth nothing. Her voice steadied as she went, the way it did when something mattered. But I'd burn down this whole pretty house to get back to him. He's the kindest person I've ever known. He remembers everyone's birthday. He cries at dog commercials. And he can't do a single thing for anybody, and both of those are true at the same time. She stepped toward him. Didn't mean to. The anger walked her forward. People aren't tools, Dominic. You don't measure a life by how useful it is. Not Sam's. Not mine. She held his eyes. Not yours. That last one was a guess. A shot in the dark. She watched it land somewhere deep, in a place that hadn't been touched in a very long time. He didn't answer. Knock. The door opened. The man with the gray temples leaned in. Nora would later learn his name was Renzo, that he'd been with the family 40 years, that he'd held both these boys as babies. Boss, Tess is here. She says it can't wait. 2 minutes, Dominic said, not looking away from Nora. The door closed. You can lock my body in this house, Nora said, quiet now. The fight had cost her and she had a little left, and she spent it on this. You've got the guns. You've got the doors. Fine, but you should know something. She lifted her chin. You don't own me. You can't. Nobody owns a person. In this country, a long time ago, and it was the worst thing we ever did, and we're still paying for it. You can keep me here. You can't make me yours. Those are not the same thing, and a man as smart as you already knows it. Held its breath. Dominic looked at her for a long, long moment. Then something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of where one might go. And up, he called toward the door. Guest room. The good one. Food, clothes, whatever she needs. His eyes stayed on Nora. Can someone find out everything about a young man named Sam Bennett? Tonight, I want to know he's safe before morning. He is not to be touched. He is not to be frightened. Is that clear? Renzo's voice surprised through the door. Yes, boss. Nora blinked. Why would you? Because you're right, Dominic said. The words seemed to cost him. Not about leaving. Not leaving, that part's real. And I won't lie to you about it, but about him. A muscle worked in his jaw. Man shouldn't suffer because my men can't tell two women apart. That's not justice. That's just sloppy. It wasn't kindness. He wouldn't have called it that. But Nora had spent 12 years learning to read the truth a body tells when the mouth won't. And she saw it, the small, buried, half-dead thing in him that had heard her, that had been waiting a long time for someone to say, you too are worth more than what you can do. She didn't trust him. She'd be a fool to. But as Renzo led her down the hall, past the paintings, toward a room that was a cage with very nice sheets, Nora Bennett understood one thing clearly. She hadn't just walked into a monster's house. She'd walked into a man who'd been told he was a monster his whole life and never once been told he could be anything else. And somewhere under all that fear and fury and exhaustion, the nurse in her, the part that ran toward the bleeding instead of away, recognized a wound when she saw one. The deepest kind. The kind nobody had ever tried to close. The guest room was a beautiful prison. Nora woke in sheets so soft they felt like an apology. Gray light came through tall windows she'd already checked, locked, 3 stories up, a garden below, then a wall, then nothing she could see. For a second she didn't remember. And she did, all at once, the way bad news always lands twice once when it happens, and again every morning after. She sat up. She was wearing a black button-down shirt that wasn't hers. A man's shirt. It swallowed her shoulders and pulled tight across her hips, and she hated what that meant, that someone had decided, while she slept, what she'd wear. She got out of bed, found her own scrubs gone, found a closet full of clothes in her size, tags still on, like someone had measured her in the night. That scared her more than the locks did. A knock. The door opened before she could answer. Marco, the one from the hallway. He wouldn't look at her. He carried a silver tray fruit cut into shapes, warm bread, coffee that smelled like a different life. Mr. Castellano wants you at breakfast, he muttered. When you're ready. I have a question. He paused at the door. Last night, Nora said, when you grabbed me. You knew you were taking a person out of a hospital against her will. A nurse. You knew that, and you did it anyway. I just want to understand how a person decides that's okay. Marco's jaw worked. For a second, she thought he'd say nothing. I don't get to decide, he said. That's the whole point of the job. Everybody decides, Nora said quietly. Every single time. Saying you don't is just a way to sleep at night. He left fast, but she saw it land. She was getting good at watching things land on these men. She didn't eat. Her stomach was a fist. She marched down the long hall to find him, because sitting and waiting felt like agreeing to something. Dominic was at the head of a table built for 20, reading a newspaper like it was an ordinary Tuesday. He looked up. Those gray eyes moved over her, the borrowed shirt, the bare feet, the chin she kept up by force. He didn't look angry. He looked, God help her, almost pleased. Sit, Nora. I want my clothes. I want a phone. And I want to go home. She stayed standing. People are going to notice I'm gone. My patients. My landlord. The police. Dominic folded the paper, slid a sleek phone across the table. Look, she didn't want to. She looked. It was all there, like he'd promised. The resignation, the lease, and now a third thing, a text from her number to Mrs. Okafor. Got called away for a family thing out of state. Can you keep Sam a few weeks? I'll pay double. So sorry. We'll explain soon. Sent at 4:12 a.m. The room tilted. You texted my brother's caregiver, Nora said. Her voice came out very low. From my phone. Pretending to be me. I made the situation manageable. You reached into my life, my actual life. She was shaking now, but not with fear. One thread holding a sick man's days together, and you didn't even ask. You just decided. Like, he's a problem on your desk. He's being cared for, Dominic said. I checked. He's fine. He's better than fine. There's money in the account now. The heat's been fixed in your building. The back rent's gone. I made his life easier. You made his life yours, she said. Don't get to fix my brother's heating to feel better about kidnapping his sister. That's not generosity. That's a leash with a bow on it. He went still. She'd cut him. She watched it. Before he could answer, another voice cut in from the doorway. A woman's. Dry, even-edged. She's right, you know. A woman walked in. 50s, maybe. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, a leather folder under her arm. She set it on the table and looked at Dominic like she'd looked at him 1,000 times and lost patience around the 400th. Tessa, Dominic said. A warning. Don't Tessa me. She poured herself coffee, uninvited, the way only someone untouchable does. You dragged a civilian out of a hospital, a nurse. You forged her resignation, terminated her lease, and impersonated her to an elderly woman. Legally, that's kidnapping, fraud, and about 6 other things I'd rather not catalog before noon. She sipped. Operationally, it's a disaster. And personally, she looked at him over the rim. It's exactly what your father would have done. The room dropped 10 degrees. Careful, Dominic said. No, Tessa said. You be careful. Knew Salvatore Castellano. I watched what he did to people who became useful to him. I watched what he did to you. Cash in the back of a butcher shop because a son who couldn't earn wasn't a son. He was an expense. She set the cup down. And now there's a woman in your house who you took because she was useful for an hour. You're not solving a problem, Dominic. Inheriting one. You're becoming the thing that broke you. Silence. Nora stood very still and watched a man she'd been terrified of an hour ago go pale at the edges. Leave us, Dominic said. Tessa held his eyes a bead. Then she gathered her folder. On her way out, she stopped beside Nora. Up close, her face was kinder than her voice. For what it's worth, she said, low, I'm sorry. You shouldn't be here. Then lower still, he's not all the way gone. But he's close. Be careful which one you talk to. She left. The big room felt very large and very empty. Is it true? Nora asked. She didn't plan to. It came out, what she said, about you. At 9, Dominic looked at the window for a long time. My father believed, he said slowly, that love was a weakness other men exploited. That the only safe thing to be was necessary. So he made me necessary. He made me good at being necessary. And he made very sure I understood that the day I stopped being useful was the day I stopped being his son. He turned to her. You said something last night. Don't measure a life by what it's worth to you. A muscle moved in his jaw. Nobody ever told me that. Not once. 40 years, and you're the first. Nora's anger didn't go away, but it made room for something else. Pity, maybe. Dangerous kind that makes you forget a man can be both wounded and a wolf. Then prove she's wrong, Nora said softly. Let me go. For one breath, she thought he might. Then his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it. His whole face changed, closed, hardened, the wolf back behind the eyes. What? He said into it. Nora watched the blood leave his face and come back colder. Where, he said. When? Who saw him? Another pause. Put 2 men on him. No, 4. Nobody gets near the boy. He hung up. Looked at Nora. And for the first time, what was in his eyes wasn't possession. It was fear. For her, what? Nora whispered. What happened? Is it Sam? Sam's fine, Dominic said. Sam's safe. I told you he would be. Around the table, fast, close. But someone was watching your apartment last night. Someone who doesn't work for me. They photographed your brother through the window. The floor dropped out of Nora's stomach. They know about him, Dominic said, which means they know about you. Which means the people who sent Marco for the wrong woman, the people who set this whole thing up, they know exactly who you are now. Who? Nora breathed. Who set it up? Dominic's jaw was iron. That's the question, isn't it? He said. Contact who told my men to grab a nurse in a blue cardigan. He held her eyes. That contact works for the man who's been trying to take everything from me for 2 years. And somebody inside that hospital handed you to him on a plate. Nora thought of a crying woman pushing a soft blue cardigan into her hands. It's freezing up there. Just take it, please. You're a lifesaver. Oh, Nora said, very quietly. They didn't let her leave. But the locks felt different now. Before, they'd been there to keep her in. Now Nora understood they were also keeping something out. That was the thing nobody warned you about danger, how fast a cage starts to look like cover. The day in a strange, suspended quiet. She checked on Elio twice. The boy was holding. Feverish, weak but holding, and grateful in a loopy, half-conscious way that made him hard to hate. He called her the angry angel. She told him to stop talking and drink water. In the late afternoon, Renzo brought her a phone, Dominic's, supervised, and let her call Sam. Sam's voice came through warm and slow and so dear it nearly broke her. Nor, where'd you go? Mrs. O said you had a work trip. Did you bring me anything? Her voice caught. She made it steady, because his ears were good for things like that. I'm okay, bud. I'm okay. I'll be home soon. You taking your pills. Morning and night, he said proudly. And I watered your plant. It was thirsty. She closed her eyes. You're the best brother in the whole world. You know that. I know, Sam said, like it was just a fact, which it was. Love you, Nor. Love you more. She handed the phone back to Renzo before her face could fall apart in front of him. The old man took it gently. He sounds like a good kid, Renzo said. He's the best of us, Nora said. All of us. Everyone I've ever met. He's the best one. Renzo nodded slow, like that meant something to him. Dinner was just the 2 of them. A long table, 2 places set at one end, candles she hadn't asked for. She almost didn't come. She came anyway. You learn more at the table than behind a locked door. Dominic poured wine she didn't touch. For a while, neither of them spoke. The food was extraordinary. She barely tasted it. You called your brother, he said finally. Your man stood 3 feet away the whole time. I know. A pause. He said you told Sam you were okay. When you're not. Dominic turned his glass slowly. Why lie to him? Being scared is bad for his heart. She met his eyes. Protecting someone you love sometimes means carrying the fear so they don't have to. You wouldn't know about that. I think I don't love my brother. I think you'd kill for him, Nora said. That's not the same thing. Anybody can kill for somebody. The hard part is living for them. Showing up. Carrying the boring weight. Watering the plant. She set down her fork. Killing's loud. Love is mostly quiet. Most men only learn the loud kind. He was quiet a long moment. My father, he said, loved loudly. With his fists mostly. By the time I was 12, I'd learned that the people who said they loved you were the most dangerous people in the room. He looked at the candle, so I got very good at not needing it. Need is a door. Doors get kicked in. And lonely, Nora said softly. Doors also let people in who'd water your plant. Something crossed his face. He didn't answer. Can I ask you something? She said. And will you tell me the truth? Maybe. Why me? Not why you grabbed me, that was a mistake. I know that. Why am I still here? Don't tell me it's the ledger or because I saw your face. 100 ways to make a witness disappear, and you used exactly none of them. So why? He looked at her for a long time across the candlelight. Because in my whole life, Dominic said slowly, everyone who's come into this house wanted something. Money, protection, a piece of the empire. They flatter me. They fear me. They calculate me. He leaned forward. Knelt on my floor with your hands inside my brother, and you weren't calculating anything. You weren't afraid of the right things. You yelled at me. You told me I don't own you. You told me Sam is worth everything and can do nothing, and both are true. His voice dropped. And who might be wrong? You did it the first hour. Nora's heart did something she didn't give it permission to do. That's not a reason to keep someone, she said. That's a reason to let them go and hope they come back. I don't know how to do that, he said, plainly, like a man admitting he can't read. And that, Nora thought, was the truest thing he'd said yet. She set her hands on the table, decided to spend something. To tell you about my mother, she said. Then you'll understand me and maybe you'll stop trying to. He waited. She was big, like me, bigger. And she was the warmest person in any room, and the world treated her like furniture. Doctors talked past her. Strangers felt entitled to her body comments, advice, that look. She got really sick. She'd been ignored so long that when something was actually wrong, nobody listened, including the doctors. They saw the size and stopped seeing the woman. She died of something that gets caught early in a body people bother to look at. Her voice was steady. She'd told this story before, to herself 10,000 nights. So I became a nurse, and I decided I would look at every single person who came through my doors. The drunk, the rude, the dying, the ones nobody else would touch. She held his gaze. Every person is worth looking at, Dominic. Worth the full attention, not because of what they can do for you, because they're here, because they're a person, and that's the whole reason, and it's enough. It has always been enough. My mother was enough. Sam is enough. A beat. You're enough. 10 years old, counting cash in a butcher shop, and your father was a liar. The candle guttered. She watched a 40-year-old wall develop a crack right down the middle. Dominic Castellano, head of a crime family, a man who'd had people killed, a man who could erase her by lunchtime, sat at his enormous table and looked, unguarded second, exactly like the boy who'd been told he was an expense. He didn't cry. Men like him don't, in front of anyone. But his hand, resting on the white cloth, closed slowly into a fist, then opened, then lay flat. Like he was setting something down he'd carried a long way. You don't look at me the way I look at you, he said finally. Rough. You should know that. When I look at you. He stopped. Started again. I was raised to see what's useful. And I look at you and useful isn't the word. There isn't a word. You're just, he shook his head once, the most real thing that's walked through that door in 20 years. It wasn't about her body. She'd braced for it to be about her body. She'd spent her life braced for that. It wasn't. He was looking at the her of her. And that, Nora realized with a cold, clear drop of fear, was far more dangerous than the locks. Because she could fight a man who wanted her body. She had no practice fighting one who saw her soul and called it the realest thing in the house. The doors opened, and his face was wrong. Boss, his old voice shook. The cameras at the south gate just went dark. All of them. Same time. Sentence finished. The tenderness gone like it had never been. The wolf fully back. Get her downstairs, he said. Now to Elio's room. Lock it. What's happening? Nora was up too. Dominic, he turned to her. 1 second, one only. He put his hand against the side of her face, not claiming, not owning, just touching, like he needed to know she was solid. Whatever happens in the next hour, he said, you stay alive. You hear me. You're not a loose end. You were never a loose end. His thumb moved once across her cheek. You were the only honest thing that ever found me. Now go. Glass shattered somewhere far off in the great dark house. And the war arrived. The war didn't come that night. A scout did. One man over the south wall while the cameras were blind. Dominic's people caught him in the garden before he reached the house. There was shouting, then 2 shots, then a silence that was almost worse. Nora heard it all from Elio's room. Enzo had locked her in with the sick boy, and a gun he set on the dresser like he hoped she wouldn't notice it. She noticed. She didn't touch it. When the door finally opened, it was Dominic, on his sleeve that wasn't his. It's over, he said, for tonight. Is anyone one of theirs alive? Barely. He said it flat like a weather report. Ramos is taking him to the cellar. He knows, then he stopped. Then what? Nora said. You don't want to know the rest of that sentence. She was already on her feet. Where is he? Nora, where is he? She crossed the room. You said it's one of theirs. Alive, but barely. That means bleeding. That means a person dying in your basement, and you're standing here telling me you don't want me to know the rest of the sentence. She stopped in front of him, close, furious. I know the rest of the sentence. I've watched it happen to people in clean beds. I'm not going to stand in a room with nice sheets and pretend I can't hear it. He came here to kill you. And I'm a nurse, Nora said. Those 2 things don't cancel out. They just both stay true. Take me to him. For a long moment, Dominic looked at her like she was a language he hadn't finished learning. To put a bullet in you. I'd save anybody, she said. That's the whole point. That's the only point. The second I start deciding who's worth saving, I'm not a nurse anymore. I'm just another person with a list of who matters and who doesn't. The world's already full of those. Not need one more. She held his eyes. Neither do you. Something moved behind the gray. Renzo, Dominic said, not looking away from her. Tell Ramos to stop. The nurse is coming down. The cellar was cold and bright and smelled like a place where bad things were efficient. The man on the floor was young, younger than the gun he'd carried. He'd taken a round through the thigh and another high in the shoulder, and he was the gray-white of someone whose body was making decisions about whether to stay. Two of Dominic's men stood over him and held a length of cable. Nora didn't ask what for, and dropped to her knees beside the boy, and the world narrowed to the work. Need pressure here, you, hands now, push down. I don't care that he shot at the house, push. She got a man twice her size kneeling in the blood, doing what she said. Towels, the kit from Elio's room. Light, more light. Her hands moved fast and sure. He's not dying in a basement tonight. Nobody's dying in a basement tonight. Move. They moved. Moved when she used that voice. She'd learned a long time ago that command isn't loud. It's certain. She worked for an hour on the cold floor. She stopped at the leg. She packed the shoulder. She talked to the boy the whole time, low and steady, the way you talk to someone whose body is trying to leave. Stay with me. You're okay. I've got you. Look at me, breathe. His eyes found hers near the end. Confused, scared. Why, he managed. I know what you came to do, Nora said. Breathe. Why are you? Because you're a person, she said. And right now, you're my person. That's the whole reason. Breathe. He breathed. When it was done, she sat back on her heels, hands red, sweat in her eyes, and looked up to find Dominic standing in the cellar doorway. He'd watched the whole thing. So had his men. Nobody had said a word. Live, Nora said. If he doesn't get infected. He needs a real bed and real antibiotics, not a cable and a cellar. The man with the cable looked at Dominic, waiting for the order he'd expected. Dominic looked at the boy on the floor, at Nora kneeling in the blood, and who'd gone quiet, who were looking at her now like they'd never seen a thing like her, which they hadn't. Put him in the green room, Dominic said. Cuff him to the frame, but clean. Get him what she said. The man blinked. Boss, he's Dragos. He came over the wall. I know what we always do, Dominic said. Going to try doing something else for a while. Move him. Later, upstairs, Dominic found her washing her hands at a kitchen sink, scrubbing past her wrists out of habit. You just changed something, he said. Down there. My men. I don't know what yet. I didn't change anything, Nora said, not looking up. I just did my job in front of people who'd never seen it done. They've seen men bleed. They've never seen anyone fight to keep one of Dragos breathing. He leaned against the counter. One of them asked me after Tomas. He asked why you'd save someone who came to hurt you. He's killed people, and he genuinely didn't understand the question. What do you tell him? Dominic was quiet a moment. I told him I didn't know, he said, but that I wanted to. Nora turned off the water, dried her hands. Turned to him. Then here, she said. Here's the answer. You can have it for free. She folded the towel. When you save a person you've got no reason to save, you're not doing it for them. Not really. You're doing it to stay the kind of person who would. The man down there, he doesn't deserve it, maybe. Doesn't matter. I deserve to still be someone who'd help him. That's mine. He can't take that from me, and neither can you, and neither can Drago. She set the towel down. Mercy isn't a gift you give the other guy. Hands from turning into something you can't wash. She watched it sink into him, deep where the butcher shop was. I want to make you a deal, she said, while the door was open. You're not leaving. I know, you've made that very clear. She kept her voice level. But if you're going to keep me in a house where people keep getting shot, then I'm going to do the one thing I'm good at. I want a room, a real one. Supplies, I'll write you a list. I want to treat anyone who needs it. Your men, their families, the boy in the green room. Anyone, she lifted her chin. I'm not going to sit in nice sheets and decorate your cage. I'm going to be useful in the only way that doesn't cost anyone their soul. Dominic almost smiled. I thought you said people aren't measured by being useful. They're not, Nora said. But a person still gets to choose to be. That's different. Useful because you decide to help is freedom. Useful because somebody owns you is a leash. She held his eyes. I'm choosing. Don't mistake it for surrender. No, Dominic said softly. I wouldn't dare. He gave her the room. In 3 days. Nora wrote her list and it appeared gloves, sutures, real antibiotics, a portable monitor, an oxygen tank she eyed and decided to remember the weight of just in case. She set it all up in a sunny corner room that had held nothing before but a piano nobody played. The men came slow at first. A burn one of them had been hiding. A hand that had healed crooked because no one had said it. Tomas, the 23-year-old, came with a cough he'd had for a month and a look like he expected to be laughed at. She didn't laugh at any of them. She looked at everyone. She asked their names and used them. Nobody's asked my name before they patched me, Tomas said while she listened to his chest. Not once in this life. You're the first. That's the saddest thing I've heard all week, Nora said. And I work in a mob house. And for me, word got around. The clinic filled. And a strange thing happened in that house full of dangerous men. They started taking their boots off at her door. They started saying, "Thank you, ma'am." They started in the small ways men like that can. Becoming people again in the corner room with the piano. Dominic watched it happen and said nothing. But she caught him in the doorway sometimes, just looking, like a man watching weather he'd never seen before move across a sky he thought he knew. The boy in the green room healed. His name was Danny. He was 19. He thought no one was listening, and Nora pretended not to hear and brought him soup. "They're gonna kill me," Danny said. "When I'm better. That's how it works. Not while I'm fixing you, they're not," Nora said. "And after we'll see. The world changes. People change. Don't bury yourself before they do." It was Danny who told her in the end. His dressing. He was talking too much the way scared boys do. "You're not like I thought," he said. Drago said the nurse Castellano took was, I don't know, some plant, some informant. He was real mad they got the wrong one. Real mad. Nora's hands went still. "What did you say?" "They got the wrong one." Everybody knows. Inside the hospital was supposed to mark the right girl, and she screwed it up, and Drago's bin, the contact inside the hospital, Nora said very carefully, was a woman. Yeah, some nurse. Drago's got her over a barrel about something. Money, I think. He's always got somebody over a barrel. Nora finished the dressing. Her hands didn't shake. She made sure of that. And she went to find Tessa. Tessa kept an office in the East Wing, all glass and clean lines. She had files on everything. Nora had learned that the lawyer was the only person in the house who feared Dominic exactly the right amount, enough to be careful, not enough to lie. "Need to know about a nurse," Nora said. "At St. Bridget's. Vivian Cross." Tessa looked at her over her glasses for a long moment. Then she opened a drawer. "I wondered when you'd ask." The file was thin and terrible. Vivian Cross. Single mother. One child, a daughter, age 6. Diagnosis 9 months ago, the kind of word that ends a sentence and a life if you can't pay. The treatment cost more than Vivian made in 5 years. Insurance had found its reasons to say no. And then, 8 months ago, a loan. Who didn't lend money so much as buy people. Cassie and Drago. Half the desperate people in this city, Tessa said quietly. That's the business. Not drugs. Not guns. Debt. Drowning, and throws them an anchor and calls it a rope. Then he owns them. She closed the file. He needed someone inside that hospital. Vivian Cross needed her daughter to live. He told her to mark a nurse with a blue cardigan. She didn't know what for. Probably told herself she didn't want to know. And slowly, she thought about the crying woman in the break room. "I just got a call. It's bad. Please." The red eyes. The flicker she'd seen and ignored. She'd thought it was guilt over skipping out on a shift. It had been a woman selling a stranger to save her child. "She set me up," Nora said. The words came out hollow. "She knew. She gave me the cardigan because she knew what it meant." "Yes," Tessa said. "She did." Nora waited for the anger. It came, hot and clean. Somebody had reached into her life and put a needle in her arm and erased her and frightened her brother, and it had started with a soft blue cardigan and a coworker's wet eyes. She let the anger be there. She didn't pretend it away. And then, slowly, underneath it, the other thing came. The thing 12 years of looking at people had built in her. "She has a little girl," Nora said. "She does, 6 years old. And a man who said, 'Here's the money, just do this one thing.'" Nora pressed her hands to her face. "God, don't," Tessa said sharp. "Don't you dare forgive her sitting in that chair. She nearly got you killed. She frightened a sick man. What she did was wrong. Full stop. A reason is not a permission slip." "I know," Nora said. "I know it's wrong." She lowered her hands. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "But here's the thing I know that you don't, because you read files, and I held hands. A person can do a terrible thing for a love so big it broke them. That doesn't make the thing okay. It makes the person still a person." She stood. "I'm not going to forgive what she did. I'm going to understand why she did it. Those are different. Understanding isn't a pardon. To pretend a human being is a monster because that would be easier than the truth." Tessa studied her for a long moment. "You're going to be a problem for Drago," she said finally. "Do you know that? Men like him need everyone to be a monster or a mark. You keep insisting people are people. One thing his whole world can't survive." "Good," Nora said. "What do you want to do?" Nora looked out the glass at the grey garden, where 3 nights ago a boy had come over a wall to kill her and ended up drinking her soup. "I want to talk to her," she said. "Vivian. I want to hear it from her." And then she turned. "I think I want to do the one thing Drago would never expect. I want to help her get out from under him without it costing her daughter." "That's insane." "That's snurring," Nora said. "You find the things that's killing somebody and you take it out. Drago's killing her." So she squared her shoulders. "Get me to her." Tessa almost smiled. "No," she said. "Dominic spent 20 years learning that everyone's an angle. And you've been here a week, and his men are taking their boots off at your door, and And there's a Drago soldier alive in the green room, and now you want to save the woman who sold you. She shook her head slowly. I think he kidnapped a nurse. I think he kidnapped a mirror. Outside, far off, a phone rang in the house. Then another. Then Renzo's voice raised, urgent. Both women went still. The office door opened, and his face was carved out of stone. Drago just sent a message, he said. All my contacts at once. Same words. His eyes found Nora's. He says he knows I'm keeping his nurse. He says I have until tomorrow night to hand her over. A pause, or he burns everything. Starting with a sick boy named Sam Bennett. The room went cold and silent. Nora stood up very straight. Then we don't have until tomorrow night, she said. We have until right now. They moved fast. There wasn't another kind of moving left. Dominic put 6 men around Sam's building within the hour. Real ones. Renzo's pick, not Marco's. Nora made the call to Miss Okafor herself, supervised again, voice this time, and told the old woman to take Sam to her sisters in the country. Tonight, that there'd be a car, that it was paid for, that she'd explain everything someday. Is my Nora in trouble? Mrs. Okafor asked. Yes, Nora said. Because she didn't lie to women who'd earned the truth. But I've got people. Get Sam safe. Please. He's watering your plant, Mrs. Okafor said. Like that settled something. We'll go. Then Nora did the other thing. The hard thing. She had Tessa get Vivian Cross on a phone. The call was short. Vivian's voice came through thin and cracked and braced for screaming. Nora, oh God's Nora, I'm so stop, Nora said. Don't. I don't have time for sorry, and I'm not ready to hear it anyway, so just listen. I know about your daughter. I know what Drago did. I know what he made you do. Silence, then a sound that wasn't quite a word. I'm going to use you up and throw you out, Nora said. That's what he does. The second you stop being useful to him, you and your little girl are nothing to him. You know that. Somewhere in you, you know that. I didn't have a choice, Vivian whispered. You did. You made a bad one. We'll deal with that later. Nora kept her voice even. But right now, I'm offering you a better one. Help us, and I will get your daughter's treatment paid for. Clean, legal, no leash. Drago out of your life for good. I swear it on my brother's life, and I don't swear on that lightly. A long, ragged breath. Why? Vivian said. After what I did. Why? 'Cause you're not a monster, Nora said. You're a mother who got drowned by a man who sells anchors. I'm not going to pretend you didn't hurt me. You did. But I'm also not going to throw away a person to make myself feel righteous. So, are you in or not? A pause that lasted a life. Tell me what to do. Vivian said. It started at 9:14 p.m. The cameras went first. Then, the floods along the wall. Then, with a sound like the house clearing its throat, every light in every window died at once. And the dark came down whole. Drago hadn't waited until tomorrow night. Men like Drago never honored the clock. The deadline had only ever been a way to make them feel safe for a day. Into the black. Renzo, it's not coming up, Renzo's voice. Tight. They hit the line. Knew where it was. Then the gunfire started, and the night turned into noise. Nora had been in loud rooms her whole life. Codes, traumas, the long bright screaming of an ER on its worst night. But she'd never been in a room where the loud thing was meant to kill her. Dominic's hand found her arm in the dark, sure, and pulled her down behind the heavy oak of a doorway. Stay with me, he said, low close. Whatever happens, Elio, Nora said. He stopped. Elio's on a monitor downstairs, she said. Him antibiotics. The grid's gone. The monitor doesn't matter. I can watch him by hand. But if his line clots without the pump and nobody's there, she gripped his sleeve. And die in the dark, with no one holding his hand. I'm not going to let that happen. I have to get to him. It's not safe. None of this is safe, Nora said. That's not the question. The question is whether your brother dies alone tonight, and the answer is no. Not while I can walk. She pulled free. Cover me or don't. I'm going. 1 second in the muzzle flashlight, she saw his face torn clean down the middle, between the man who controlled everything and the one learning he couldn't control her. Go, he said. I'll clear ahead of you. Stay on my back. Do not stop. Into the dark together. The lower hall was smoke and noise. Twice Dominic fired at shapes she couldn't see. Once he shoved her flat against a wall and a burst of rounds chewed the plaster where her head had been. They reached the green room first, Danny, cuffed to the bed, panicking in the black. Don't leave me, he begged. Nora made a decision in half a second, the way she'd learned to. She grabbed the cuff key off the hook by the door, Tessa's idea, weeks of arguing. What if there's a fire, and freed his good hand? You run, I'll know I was wrong about people, she told him. Don't make me wrong. Stay low, help me with Elio. Danny, 19 and shot a week ago, and freed by the woman he'd come to kill, looked at her and made his own choice. Yes, ma'am, he said. They got to Elio. The boy was awake, scared, his line still flowing, but the pump dead and the drip gone wild. Nora's hands found the work in the dark, clamped, regulated, counted by feel. Talk to him, low. I've got you, stay with me. That's when the door across the room opened, and a flashlight beam cut the dark, and 2 men with Drago's mark stepped through with guns up. Nora didn't think. There wasn't time to think. She thought later that the not thinking was 12 years of bodies teaching her own what to do. Beside Elio's bed stood the oxygen tank, the one she'd eyed on day 1 and remembered the weight of, just in case. Thing no one in that house ever expected from the big slow nurse, she moved fast. 140 pounds and a steel cylinder into a single hard step and swung. The tank caught the lead man across the side of the skull. He dropped like a coat off a hook toward her, and a shot came from the doorway behind him, and he fell. Dominic stood in the smoke, gun up, breathing hard, but he wasn't looking at the man he'd dropped. He was looking at Nora. At the nurse standing over a downed killer with an oxygen tank in her 2 strong hands and her sick brother's name still in her mouth. "I told you," she said, panting. "Nobody dies in the dark alone. Not on my shift." By midnight it was over. Drago's men broke when their leader's number got cut off. Tessa, in the dark of her glass office, had spent the whole siege doing the quiet violence she was best at. Emails to a federal contact, a folder 2 years in the building, the kind of paper that ends a man more permanently than any bullet. His testimony was the last page, the thing that turned a folder into a cage, in his own bed for a list of crimes long enough to bury him. He'd spent his life teaching people that everyone was a monster or a mark. In the end, it was the people he'd marked who buried him. Morning came gray and quiet and smelling of smoke. The house was a wreck. Plaster down, glass everywhere, men with bandages Nora had tied moving slow through the rooms. Elio was stable. Danny had not run. He'd held a clamp all night with his one good hand and cried and not run. And in the morning he asked Nora, shy, if there was a way out of the life. It just cost everything. And he said he thought he had nothing left to spend anyway. And she told him that was exactly how you knew you were ready. Nora found Dominic in the ruined library where it had all started. He stood at the window looking at the broken garden. He'd been awake all night. He looked for once like a man and not a wolf. "It's done," he said without turning. "Drago's finished. Your brother's safe, really safe now, not safe because I said so. The threat's gone." "Good," Nora said. He turned. And in his hand were her things, her own scrubs, washed and folded, her phone, a thick envelope, and papers. "Do what I did," he said. He held them out. "Your job's back if you want. It turns out the resignation never reached the right desk. Tessa saw to that days ago. Your lease is yours again. The lie to Mrs. Okafor has been walked back. The money for Vivian's daughter is real and already moving and has nothing tied to it." He set the stack in her hands. "And there's a car out front. It'll take you anywhere you want to go." Nora stared at the papers. At him. "You're letting me leave." "I'm not letting you do anything," Dominic said. The words came hard, like they were being pulled out by the root. That was the whole sickness of it. "I thought I had the right to let you or keep you. I don't. Nobody does." He looked at her steady. "You were right that first night. On the floor with my brother's blood on your hands. You said nobody owns a person. Long time ago, and it was the worst thing we ever did. A breath. I'm 40 years old, and I had to have a nurse say it to me in my own house. Nobody owns a person. Not even when they want to keep them so badly it feels like dying to open the door." He stepped back, made room, made the door wide. "I said you were mine," he said quietly. "Forever. I had it carved into me by a man who thought love was a kind of ownership. He was wrong about that, the way he was wrong about everything." He met her eyes. "You're not mine. You never were. If you walk out that door, I'll spend the rest of my life glad I got to watch you do something that brave. And I won't follow, and I won't send anyone, and your brother will be safe to the end of his days. That's not a threat I'm taking back as a favor. It's just true now." Nora stood holding her old scrubs in a wrecked room in a stranger's house. She thought she'd feel triumphant. She'd dreamed of this for days, the open door, the car, the road home. What she felt instead was the strangest thing. She walked out. She actually walked out. The broken hall, past the men who said ma'am and meant it now, out the great front doors into the gray morning. The car was there. The driver opened the door. She stood with one hand on the cold metal. She understood something standing there free that she could never have understood behind a locked door. She didn't want to go. Not because she was broken, not because of any sickness in her or him, not the twisted thing the movies sold where the cage becomes love. None of that. The locks were gone. The fear was gone. Drago was gone. Holding her now, but the plain weight of her own wanting. And what she wanted, standing in the open door of a waiting car, was the corner room with the piano. Men relearning how to be people. Danny, who hadn't run. Elio, who called her the angry angel. The clinic she'd built. The work that mattered. And the man who'd torn a 40-year wall down to its foundation, rather than keep her 1 minute past her own choosing. That was the thing she finally understood. The source of all this had gotten backwards from the start. You cannot be given freely what was taken by force. The moment it's truly free, the moment the door is open, and the car is running, and nobody will stop you, only then does staying mean anything at all. She let go of the car door. She walked back up the steps. Dominic was still in the library. And when he heard her, and his face did something it had never done, it hoped, openly, like a boy. "You forgot something," he said. Carefully. "No," Nora said. She set her old scrubs down on the desk, where she'd woken up tied at the wrists a lifetime ago. "I came back. There's a difference. You should learn it. It's the only one that matters. A year doesn't fix a life, but it can turn it." The Castellano estate looked different now. Half of it had become something the neighborhood had never had: a free clinic, real and licensed, with Nora's name on the door and Tessa's lawyering keeping it clean. Men who'd carried guns carried supply boxes instead. Some of them, like Danny, were out of the life entirely, working honest and scared and proud. Some weren't. Change came at the speed people could survive it. Nora had stopped expecting it to come faster. Vivian Cross's daughter finished treatment in the spring. The girl rang the little bell they hung by the door for that, and the whole clinic cheered, and Vivian cried into Nora's shoulder, and Nora let her. Finally, because a year is long enough that understanding had had time to grow the slow roots of something close to forgiveness. Not the cheap kind. And you earned by showing up every day and proving the worst thing you did wasn't the whole of you. "Thank you," Vivian said. "Don't thank me," Nora said. "Go thank the next person drowning. That's how it works. You don't pay it back. You pay it forward to somebody else underwater." She squeezed Vivian's hand. "That's the only thing that ever actually psst a man like Drago, not jail. People who refuse to keep his math, insisting we're worth something we can't earn." Sam came to live at the estate that summer. There was a garden now where the wall had been shot through, and Sam watered every plant in it every morning, slow and careful, talking to them. He and Elio became friends. Elio taught him chess. Sam taught Elio that you could lose 100 games and still be the best person at the table, and Elio, who'd grown up in a house that measured everyone by their wins, needed to learn that more than anyone. Dominic watched the boy move through his house, and once, late, told Nora the truth. "To feel like he's a burden," he said, "because that's what I was taught. Who can't earn is an expense." He shook his head, slow. "Something in this house no money ever could. He just sits with you, asks about your day, means it." A pause. "My father would have called him worthless." And, Nora said, "And my father was the most worthless man I ever knew," Dominic said. "He could do everything and was worth nothing, because he never once made a single person feel safe. And do almost nothing, and he's worth everything, because everyone he meets feels safer for it." He looked at her. "You taught me that. You and a kid who waters plants." "I didn't teach you anything," Nora said. "You always knew it. They just buried it under 40 years of a dead man's lies. He helped you dig." They married in the autumn, in the garden, small. Nora wore a dress that fit the body she had, not the one the world kept telling her to have, and she had never in her life felt more entirely herself. Dominic looked at her the way he'd looked at her since the first night, not at the size of her, never that, but at the whole of her, the realest thing that had ever walked through his door. He'd asked her once, weeks before, the only way he knew how clumsy, terrified, a man who'd never been taught the soft words. "I told you that you were mine," he'd said, "forever. Back at the start. I was wrong about every part of it." He'd taken her hands. So let me say it right finally. "You're not mine. You'll never be mine. But I'd like to be yours, chosen every day, free to leave and choosing not to. That's the only forever worth having. And you could walk out of and don't." That, Nora had said, is the first completely true thing you've ever said. Is that a yes? It's a yes. At the wedding, Enzo, who'd held both Castellano boys as babies and buried his hope for them somewhere along the way, stood to say a few words and managed only one sentence before his old voice gave out. "For 40 years, he said, I watched this family measure people by what they could take. And then a nurse walked in by mistake and started measuring them by what they're worth just for being here." He wiped his eyes, not ashamed. "And that, God help us, turned out to be everything." Later, when the dancing had started and Sam had fallen asleep in a garden chair with a slice of cake still in his hand, Dominic pulled Nora close and they swayed under the lights strung where the snipers had once cut the power. "Changed my whole world," he murmured into her hair. "No," Nora said. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "This man who'd kidnapped the wrong woman and accidentally let her free him. I just looked at you. Really looked. The way everyone deserves to be looked at once, by someone who isn't counting what you're good for. And what did you see? A person," she said simply. "That was the whole reason. It was always enough." He kissed her then, in the open air, in the garden where a wall had been a free woman, who'd walked out the door and chosen to walk back in. That was the difference. That was the only one that mattered. You can't keep what you cage. You can only keep what you set free and watch in wonder as it stays. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
And so Nora Bennett's story is not simply a mafia boss romance, nor is it only a story about danger, power, kidnapping, betrayal, and survival. At its heart, this is a story about human worth. Nora enters Dominic Castellanos' world by mistake, taken because someone saw only a cardigan, a role, a useful target, not a person. But from the very first moment, Nora refuses to let that world define her. She is not a loose end. She is not a tool. She is not something to be owned, controlled, erased, or measured by usefulness. She is a nurse, a sister, a protector, a woman who has spent her life holding fragile lives in her hands and understanding that every person matters simply because they are alive. The greatest lesson this story gives us is that love is not ownership. Real love does not cage, control, or possess. Real love opens the door. It respects freedom. It gives the other person the right to choose. Dominic begins as a man shaped by violence, taught by his father that people only matter if they are useful, that kindness is weakness, and that love is just another form of power. But Nora shows him another way. She teaches him that a person can be valuable even when they cannot earn, fight, obey, or serve. Through Sam, through Vivian, through Danny, through the men in the house, and finally through Dominic himself, Nora proves that every life has dignity beyond what it can provide. This story also reminds us that mercy is not weakness. Mercy is the strength to remain human in a world that keeps asking you to become cruel. Nora saves the wounded, even when they are enemies. She helps Vivian even after Vivian betrayed her. She does not excuse wrongdoing, but she refuses to reduce broken people to their worst mistakes. That is a powerful kind of courage. It tells the audience that understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and compassion is not the same as surrender. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is look at someone who has failed, someone who has hurt us, someone the world has already condemned, and still say, "You are a person." By the end, Dominic's transformation is not about becoming softer in a simple way. It is about becoming free from the lie that made him cruel. He learns that power built on fear leaves a man empty, but a life built on respect, choice, and dignity can heal even the deepest wounds. Nora does not change him by obeying him. She changes him by standing in front of him and telling the truth. She makes him see the difference between keeping someone and being chosen by them. And that difference is everything. The meaning of this story is clear. You cannot keep what you cage. You can only truly keep what you set free. Love without freedom is possession. Protection without respect is control. Power without humanity is loneliness. But when we choose to see people fully not for what they can do, not for what they owe, not for how useful they are, but simply because they are human, we begin to break the cruel math of the world. Nora Bennett's journey teaches us that every person is enough. A sick brother who waters plants is enough. A frightened boy who wants a second chance is enough. A wounded man who was taught to be a monster is enough to try again. And a woman who was taken by force can still choose her own life, her own love, and her own forever. In the end, Nora does not stay because she is trapped. She stays because the door is open. She stays because she is free. And that is what makes her choice powerful. That is what makes the love real. This story leaves the audience with one lasting truth. The strongest hearts are not the ones that dominate others, but the ones that protect human dignity, even in the darkest rooms, even among dangerous men, even when the world forgets what a person is worth.